Hey, good afternoon, good evening, good morning, PSC 201, American Government. Whatever time you're consuming this piece of educational media, it is I, Victor McInnes, once again, coming to you live on tape from my COVID-19 compound here in Grovetown, Georgia, the Aiken Tech Outpost in Columbia County. Today, my lecture is brought to you by Shirts with Collars. Shirts with Collars, because one day you're going to want to look decent again, and you're going to need to wear a shirt with a collar. Okay, hey, today we're going on to chapter 13, part 2. For those of y'all that take Latin, that's chapter XII, part II. The slides have been uploaded in PDF format onto your Blackboard documents page. Take a moment. Go ahead and open that file so you can follow along with me. Once again, this is my Harry Potter mug, filled with, as far as you know, coffee. Okay, all right, because again, it's just too early to start drinking bourbon. If you haven't already got it, go ahead and hit pause until it comes up. Again, I'm not trying to make these files small; they're huge. So we're talking about elections part 2 today. Now, the first slide here is 2 different kinds of election machines. One is the old-fashioned kind of election machine that I voted on the first several times I voted. We're gonna, which is called where the phrase "pulling the lever" comes from. It literally had levers in them where you would pull to indicate your vote. When you guys start voting in the next year or two, you're going to use something like what you see there on the right, some form of a fill-in-the-blank bubble Scantron thing. They're going away from something. This does have a scanning factor in it. They're going away from what we have here in Georgia, which is just you push the button, you put in your vote, and then the thing clears and there's no paper record. More and more after the election tampering done by the Russian government in 2016, states are looking to secure their electoral processes. So they're bringing in a lot more machines that have some scan function, like your Scantrons for your exams. Go to the second slide, and this is the inside of the kind of machine. This is from Yazoo County, Mississippi. And this is the kind of machine that I used to work on. You'd walk in and you see the little inset picture, and you would pull the big red lever, and there would be a loud clunk, and the curtains would close behind you, and you're standing in this little mobile closet with your ability to vote. And you see those little black things in the 4 rows there? Those are levers. You would pull over a lever, and that's the person you would want to vote for. And then you would, if you wanted to, and when you pulled that one lever over, like lieutenant governors, they're pretty clear on that left-hand row right in the middle. You pull, say, the Democrat for lieutenant governor. It would then lock out all the other levers, so you couldn't vote twice. If you wanted to change your vote, if you decided that you'd voted for wanted to change your vote, you manually move that lever back up to the upright position, and then you can move another one. And then when you're finished voting, there'd be a little sign there that said, would say open for that big red lever. You would pull that to the right, and that big red lever, when you pulled that, all the levers that you had pulled over would go back to upright, and that would be how you would record your vote. And when everything was over with, at the end of the day, one of the election marshals, those people that work at the polls are called election marshals, they would go to all the different polling machines, and they would, in any political party that wanted to have a representative there to ensure that things were being done above board, would follow along, and then they just write down the number of votes every candidate got. And then they would take those sheets and they would and then that machine would be locked. It would not be tampered with. It would be impossible to tamper with that until after the election was all over with and the Secretary of State had certified the election. Then all those machines would be reset. But there was a mechanical record of how you had voted. The last time these things were used, I think, in a statewide elections was back in 2008 or 2012. But some of the states hung on to them, and now some of them are actually, some states, because they now no longer trust their electronic voting methods, states are now bringing the old Shoop voting machines, and this was made by a company called Shoop. They're bringing the Shoop voting machines back out. Okay, so that's a little bit of history for you. All right, let's go to the next slide. Okay, so how to become the President of the United States. This is where we left off last time. We sort of looked at, This is a really good graphic that sort of breaks everything down. You have the constitutional requirements, you have your primaries and caucuses, you have your natural convention, you have your general election, then you have your electoral college. We're not going to talk about a lot about the electoral college. We talked about that when we talked about the Constitution. But we are going to start with the primaries and the caucuses, and we're just going to kind of walk through it. Okay, so go to the next slide. So when you're running for president, you have two separate and distinct tasks. First thing you need to do is you need to win the nomination. The second thing you need to do is you need to win the general election. And that was laid out pretty clearly in this. So what we're going to talk about first, let's go to the next slide. Getting the nomination. Now, getting the nomination, you have to win delegates to the national party conventions. Now, there's two ways to win that nomination and get those delegates. The first is a caucus. Now, caucuses used to be really popular. They were done in a lot of states. In 2016, 11 states still had caucuses. Back in the old days, every state had either a caucus or a convention to pick their delegates. You didn't in many states where when that happened, you didn't actually pick the candidate, but you voted for a delegate that would go to the convention. But as it says here, you can see this time in 2020, only 4 states, Iowa, North Dakota, Wyoming, and Nevada, had caucuses. Caucus is a meeting of the members of a political party for the purpose of selecting a candidate or delegates to a convention. That we understand that. We've talked about caucuses before. Some states hold one big, huge caucus or a few large caucuses, like Nevada. Nevada holds big caucuses. Others, like Iowa, hold hundreds. I think Iowa had 700 caucus meetings this election cycle. Usually, the problem with a caucus is that a caucus is not a broad spectrum of the people in the party. Caucuses are usually limited to people that are dedicated to the party. They're usually held at night, so people who work shift work or work at nights can't make it to the caucuses. So what you're left with is a small, the people who show up are dedicated party activists that have time to be really involved in party politics. So more extreme candidates benefit. So if you look at the Iowa caucuses this year, the candidates that benefited the most were Bernie Sanders and Pete Buttigieg. They both did really well in the Iowa caucuses. Due to the way Iowa counts votes, which I'm not even going to begin to get into because it's just crazy, Pete Buttigieg won the most delegates to the Democratic Convention, but Bernie Sanders won the popular vote. The number of caucuses fell significantly between 2016 and 2020, and that's because it's just ungainly. It just takes forever, and we have massive problems like we did with Iowa. The candidates claim they like it, but I don't really think they do. The parties don't like it because it takes a lot of effort to set a caucus up. When if it's a primary, the state's Secretary of State handles it. So the numbers have been falling fairly consistently, and then Iowa just turned into a complete train wreck this year. So there is some discussion that 2020 may have been the last election cycle that had caucuses for a presidential election. Again, we're down from 11 to 4. Iowa, North Dakota, Wyoming, and Nevada. So if it continues in that trend, there will be no caucuses in 2024. Okay, let's go to the next slide, primaries. Primaries are held in 46 states and all the territories and the District of Columbia. For many candidates, the primaries are a really good opportunity because like this year, we had 22 candidates that mounted major efforts for the Democratic nomination. In 2016, at one point in time, there were 17 Republicans on the debate stage because when the incumbent president is leaving, the people of the opposition party will just flock to the primaries. And there was a lot of Republicans last time with President Obama leaving. A lot of Republicans thought it was their shot. This time, the perception that President Trump is very unpopular brought a lot of Democrats in. So the issue isn't that, for most candidates is just getting your name out there to be seen on a national stage. And the best way to do that is to win early in a primary. Winning early in a primary state shows that you've got a broad base of support, that a lot of people want you to be the party nominee. So that momentum in early states is really important. Now, the Democrats allocate their delegates that you win from a primary pretty much in a universal way. If you get all the candidates who get at least 15% of the vote get a proportional share of the delegates from that state. So let's say Bernie Sanders gets 31%, Joe Biden gets 30%, Amy Klobuchar gets 16%, and then Pete Buttigieg gets 14%. Well, Pete Buttigieg is not going to get any delegates from that state because he did not achieve that 15% threshold. Amy Klobuchar is going to get, the biggest chunk of them are going to go to evenly divided between, are going to get the even number between Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders. Amy Klobuchar is going to get a smaller percentage because she did get 16%. She did meet that 15-point threshold, so she will get some delegates, but again, they're split proportionally. Now, the Republicans this time have just decided they're all over the place. It's kind of hard. 7 states have decided they're just not going to hold primaries. They're going to have a convention, which means the Republican committees within each state is going to pick. And these are states like Alabama. I mean, hardcore red states, and that's their party's choice, and that is a legal choice. There is no law anywhere that says you have to have a primary. In those states, in the other 43 states in the District of Columbia and Territories, there's just a wild mix. Some of them have, a lot of them went to winner take all this year because they want President Trump to get a unanimous vote at the convention. Some states are doing some proportional giving out of the delegates. Some are using a hybrid system. It's just all over the place. It's just basically right now this year, while the Democrats have struggled to come up with something that will allow them to, give a standard, the Republicans are just basically saying Trump's going to be the nominee. Let's just make it easy as possible. Okay, go to the next slide. Now, as you all know from you've been watching the elections and we've been talking about it, this year, every year, the first 2 states for a long time have been Iowa and New Hampshire. And people, a lot of times you'll hear people talk about the tyranny of Iowa and New Hampshire. Remember that due to the number of candidates in the race, usually name recognition early on is incredibly important. Doing well in New Hampshire and Iowa is usually a key to a candidate's success. I mean, you saw it this year. Bernie Sanders, Pete Buttigieg did really well in Iowa and New Hampshire. Elizabeth Warren, I mean, candidates just started dropping off. If you can't get some sort of name recognition and get some sort of voting totals in New Hampshire and Iowa, that's when you see a lot of the candidates left the race in those next 2 weeks. And then the third, this one is kind of weird because Joe Biden was going to be the choice of among African American voters. Polling showed that over and over again. So when the third primary was your very own, the local South Carolina, which was going to be the first state that even remotely resembled the demographics, and then from South Carolina you went to Nevada, which has a very large Latino population. So there was going to be these 2 states that were really diverse immediately afterwards. So New Hampshire and Iowa, total population of just under 4.5 million people. And again, Iowa is 93.2% white. New Hampshire is 90.7% white. How in the world did these 2 states with these tiny populations that are almost disproportionately white for the rest of the nation? The rest of the United States is not 93.2% white. That's just not the case at all. So, and I have in-laws, and my wife's family is originally from New Hampshire. I have a lot of in-laws in New Hampshire, and the people in New Hampshire will tell you very condescendingly that they think their vote is more important, so they pay more attention. In the past, the parties like having, there's just been a tradition at this point. The parties like having these 2 states first because it allows them to get the candidates in one place to where they can sort of manage what's going on. The media loves it because they just they stake out the 2024 election offices for all the major networks will open in Iowa and New Hampshire in the next year. within 6 months after this presidential election, all the news networks and all the broadcast networks will open full-time offices in Iowa and New Hampshire because it's cheaper, and that way they can find all the candidates at one time. Now, in the past, the parties have been so in favor of this that they've said that if states have tried to push their primaries, and South Carolina was one of the last ones that tried it. They tried to push their primaries ahead of Iowa and New Hampshire. And the parties we're going to punish them. They say, yeah, you can try that, but we're going to have to take half your delegates away from you with the conventions. And what that means is your state's not going to be in any way important when it comes to getting the nomination, so you'll never see the candidates. This time there has been so much pushback that there is a real possibility that things will change for 2024. There's a lot of people say that Nevada is going to switch over to a primary away from a caucus, and then that'll go first. A lot of people are saying that South Carolina should get to go first, which will make South Carolina really important. And if that happens in 2024, you guys are going to be overrun with presidential candidates, and your media will be nothing but. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So in August of this year, we're going to have two political conventions. They alternate between which goes first, Democrat and Republican. Let's talk about the conventions for a while. In the past, the conventions were the places nominees were elected. There were huge arguments. People would just, fight over who got the nominee. Because remember, back in the day, you didn't vote for the presidential candidate. You vote for your delegate, just like you didn't vote for in some states until recently, the name of the president didn't appear on the ballot. The members of the Electoral College appeared on the ballot, running for the Electoral College. So a brokered convention is where people go into the convention and nobody knows who's going to be the nominee. Were the norm up until the 1950s. The worst one was in 1924. The Democratic National Convention split on prohibition. And it boiled down to these three guys on the top, McAdoo, Smith, and Davis. McAdoo was the Secretary of Treasury. Al Smith was the governor of New York, and John Davis was the United States ambassador to the United Kingdom. So they went through 103 ballots. 54 different candidates were on the ballot at one time or the other. It was just a complete and total, the words I want to use I shouldn't use in class. It was just a train wreck, and it was just horrible. John Davis, the guy on the very austere-looking gentleman here on the right, on the top row, was nobody's favorite candidate. When things started dragging on, the Ku Klux Klan showed up and demanded to be represented as a state. It was just a complete and total insane thing. Finally, on the 103rd ballot, after 13 days, the party finally just went, yeah, John Davis, whatever, let's just get the hell out of here. So they picked John Davis. He ran against Calvin Coolidge. John Davis takes the southern states from basically Texas to the Atlantic coast, the former Confederacy, as you might call it. Calvin Coolidge took literally everything else. It was a horrendous electoral blowout. Davis has been lost to history. Al Smith was the governor of New York and is still remembered as the governor of New York. Mr. McAdoo, anyway, Secretary of Treasury. But, it showed. And in 1924, parties began to realize we can't do this again because they attributed, if Al Smith was very popular governor of New York, if their convention had been more efficient, they may have won the presidency. The last brokered convention was the Republican convention in 1952. It boiled down to war hero, famous general, well-loved individual, Dwight Eisenhower, against a noted academician and politician, Adlai Stevenson, who you see there on the left. Eisenhower had gotten into the election very late. He claimed he didn't want to be president. He'd been the commander of all Allied forces in Europe for World War II. He'd been the first supreme commander of NATO. He claimed he didn't want to be president, but both the Democrats and the Republicans courted him very hard. So at the last minute, he sort of jumps into the race. He has a large number of delegates rolling into the first vote, but the delegates were locked down until after the first ballot. So there was the possibility that Ambassador Stevenson could do some maneuvering and would take it in the first ballot. That didn't happen. Once the delegates were released, so the rules were you have to vote the way you were elected in the first ballot, and in the second ballot you can vote however you want. And so in the second ballot, Eisenhower takes a massive win in the Republican convention. He goes on to win a massive landslide in the 1952 election. Does 2 terms as president in the late 1953 to 1961 when John Kennedy follows him. The last convention that opened without the nomination really secured was the 1976 Republican Convention. Gerald Ford was the President of the United States. He had been approved by Congress. Spiro Agnew, Vice President of the United States, had been indicted in federal court for for tax evasion, but it turned out it was pretty much proven as Governor of Maryland, as Vice President of the United States, he took a lot of bribes. Nixon was forced out of office because of the Watergate breaks-in. Gerald Ford is approved by the House of Representatives to be the vice president. He becomes president. The Republican Party's got this bad smell on it because of Watergate. Jimmy Carter is the Democratic nominee. So Ronald Reagan ran for the nomination for 1976 for the Republican Convention. They go in, and it's split. Ronald Reagan doesn't have enough votes to get the nomination. Gerald Ford doesn't have enough. There's some other candidates that have soaked up some votes. So Ford and Reagan cut a deal that if Reagan was allowed to give a speech at the convention, he would give all his votes over to Gerald Ford, which before the first ballot, which he did. And Ronald Reagan gives this fantastic speech, this brilliant speech, that really sets him up for the 1980 run for the president as the Republican. And we're going to talk about that, and that's a good example of what we're going to talk about next. Okay? Go to the next slide. Political conventions for the last 44 years have been just already settled. Again, the conventions aren't till August. It's early April. The Democratic nomination was settled last week when Bernie Sanders conceded. Why do we even care? Well, first of all, it gives an opportunity for the candidates to rebrand themselves. Candidates have to remember how we talked about in caucuses, but in general it's true. In order to appeal to the party hardcore, the party faithful, a candidate has to run to either to the far right for the Republicans or the far left for the Democrats. The conventions give the candidates a chance to sort of say, okay, now this is the new me. It gives everybody a chance to get in one place at one time from the party and have sort of go rah, 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 and say, yes, we love our candidate. They serve as focusing events. Excuse me for 1 second here. I am going to mute because I can't mute. Okay. Pollen. It's for lunch. Okay. So, and it also, one of the biggest things it does that nobody really talks about, it gives a spotlight for new faces in the party. In 1980, Ronald Reagan was a former governor, or 1976, Ronald Reagan was a former governor from California. He garnered a lot of votes in the primaries, but nobody really thought he had a chance to win the election. But he gives the speech right before Gerald Ford accepts the nomination. And he gives this explosive speech that everybody loves, and he becomes the face of the new Republican Party. This is a picture, this young gentleman here that looks way, way like it's not, just a mere, couple of years ago. This is the 2004 Democratic National Convention when Barack Obama was just a young state senator from Illinois. And again, I've said this time and time again, I saw that speech and went, that guy's going to be president. It allowed him, he gave the keynote address for the convention. It allowed him to establish himself as a real force and a young up-and-coming face in the party. If you go back one, established party platforms, it's where the party gets together and officially says, hey, we believe in sensible gun legislation. We believe in everybody should be able to own a gun. We're very pro-choice. We're very pro-life. We believe, and it says this is what the party believes. Now, the candidates follow what the party believes. Yes and no. That's up for grabs. But again, there's been no doubts about the outcome for the last 44 years. Ratings have been horrible. Even though TV has been cut, they used to be 6 hours a day for 5 days. Now they're down to like 2 hours a day for 4 days. Often it's seen as nothing more than a political pep rally. And the question is coming out more and more. They do offer some clarity, but do they really are they really deserving of 12 hours of primetime viewing on every network? Do we shut down, the television for a week, twice, for these guys? And the answer is becoming more and more. We're not sure. And again, with COVID-19, nobody's even sure that we're going to have conventions this year. Nobody's really known what's going to happen this year. Okay, so let's go to the next one, the general election. And again, this is not. We've discussed elections. We've discussed there last time that there isn't one presidential election. There's 51 local elections within states in the District of Columbia. But this is the campaign. The role of the campaign is to tell people how to feel about the state of the nation. Either you're going to assign blame or you're going to get credit. And it's really clear from 1980 to 1992, 12 years in presidential politics. In 1980, Ronald Reagan was running as the Republican nominee against the sitting president, Jimmy Carter. And Ronald Reagan very simply got up and said, and there was a recession that was going on. The United States was getting beat up politically around the world. We were getting embarrassed by the Soviet Union. We had gotten embarrassed by the Iranians seizing our embassy and holding hostages. So Ronald Reagan got up and said, are you better off than you were 4 years ago? And the majority of the people said, no. So Ronald Reagan wins by this massive landslide. Well, Ronald Reagan starts doing all the things that make America. I mean, we start pouring money into the defense, our defense budget. We started. Soldiers are well respected again. Ronald Reagan goes out of his way to do a lot of the things that Americans love to see, and then he starts spending so much money, the economy begins to recover. So in 1984, Ronald Reagan made the claim that it's morning in America again. It's a rebirth. It's a new time of renewal, and things are great, so stick with Ronald Reagan. Well, Ronald Reagan got elected by the biggest electoral landslide in the history of the nation. In 1988, George Bush 41, the first President Bush, made the same claim. Hey, it's great. Why change course? We're doing really well. and Bush gets elected. But in 1992, a recession had hit. And Bill Clinton sort of made the case that George Bush was out of touch. He didn't understand how the economy was doing. Bill Clinton, and if you go back and look for this clip, it's absolutely brilliant, where he looks into the camera and he says, George Bush does not understand your pain. I feel your pain. And he just made all the problems in the world George Bush's problems, and just like Reagan had done 12 years earlier, he was asking, are you better off now than you were when these guys got elected the first time? Now it's time to go a different way. He won by huge margins. And really what it boils down to is what it says there at the bottom, retrospective voting, things that are voting on what has happened in the past. Up until a couple of weeks ago, when as many as 16 million people lost their jobs all at once, President Trump was going to run on retrospective voting. He was going to run on a strong economy. The economy has been great for the last 4 years. And that's what he was going to run on. Well, that's not what he can't run on that anymore, because the economy is very quickly, because of COVID-19, going down the tubes. Then there's prospective voting, voting on what you think might happen in the future. In 1980, Ronald Reagan ran on prospective voting. In 1984, Ronald Reagan ran on retrospective voting. Okay, and you can see every candidate doing that. Usually, people that are in office, incumbents, run retrospectively. Hey, I've done great things for you. Candidates that are outside of power that are trying to again going, hey, things will be better when I get there. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. And this is something I just want to touch on very quickly. Not going to take a lot of time with it. How do we form our opinions? Well, we form our opinions by what we see on TV. This is from 2016. And there is some belief now that it's even more skewed. If you look at it, cable TV news, social media, local TV, news websites or apps, radio, network television news, local late night comedy. Yeah, people look to Stephen Colbert and Jimmy Fallon and Jimmy Kimmel for their and Trevor Noah for their news. Local newspapers, national print newspapers, websites, and then candidates' campaigns. If you aggregate all the TV, cable TV, local TV, network nightly news, late night comedy shows, 51% of all information consumed comes from television. Okay, and why campaigns, like we talked about in the last lecture, are so insanely expensive is because the most expensive media to advertise on is television. But because that's where people are at over half the time, okay, that's where they get their news. Okay, so let's look at congressional elections. Go to the next slide, congressional elections. Here's the thing you need to know about congressional elections. We may say we hate Congress, and everybody says we hate Congress. I ran that slide much earlier in the course where people said that cockroaches were more popular than Congress, okay? But here's the thing about it. We hate Congress, we love our congressmen. In the U.S. House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate, 90% of the time we re-elect the incumbent. Members have the advantages of the office they hold. They get to mail things for free. They get to go fly back to the district every weekend. And that's why Congress only works from Tuesday to Thursday, because Friday they fly back to the districts and Monday they fly back to Washington. And we pay for that. Taxpayers pay for that. And they get to command TV if they want to have a big event. You know, if Joe Wilson wants to have a veterans conference, he gets TV for that. Incumbents can take credit for every good thing that has happened in the district since they got elected. And then ultimately, and we've already talked about gerrymandering, the party in power can redraw the districts in any way they so desire. The best chance that someone has to knock an incumbent out of office in the Congress is like we saw in 2016. Off-year elections when there's no presidential election, the party that's out of power, the party that does not hold the White House, has a good chance of doing well. And in 2018, the Democrats did historically well. The pictures here on the right is Senator Robert C. Byrd. He was a Democrat from West Virginia. He was first elected to the U.S. House of Representatives. That's the upper picture. In January of 1953, he stayed in he within 6 years later moved over to the Senate. He was there until 2010. He is the longest serving member of the U.S. House of Representatives and combined the U.S. legislative branch with 57 years, 5 months, and 26 days. The first picture is when he went into office, and the second picture is when he came out of office. That's how long that dude was in the chair. Robert Byrd, very interesting guy, ran as a Democrat in West Virginia in the 1950s. He was a member of the Ku Klux Klan. He was a staunch segregationist, but by the early 1960s, when he is in the Senate, he is one of the strongest backers of the Civil Rights Bill and the Voting Rights Act. Very interesting guy. Going on to the next state, and from the Palmetto State, Strom Thurmond was number 3 on the list of longest serving senators, served 47 years, 5 months, and 8 days. You guys all have heard of Strom Thurmond. Fritz Hollings, and Strom Thurmond flipped over from being a Democrat to being a Republican because he refused to vote for the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act and thought that the Democratic Party was going to explode. Ran for president in 1948 as a Dixiecrat, but on strong segregationist principles. Stuck to those. I won't say he stuck to his segregationist principles to the very end, but he was, anyway, Strom Thurmond, if you want to learn, you probably know about Strom Thurmond. If you want to learn about him, he's a very difficult character in American history to deal with. Fritz Hollings, on the other hand, radically different guy. He was number 12 on the list of longest serving senators, did 38 years, 1 month, 25 days. Fritz Hollings was the governor of South Carolina, and we especially want to highlight him because he was instrumental in setting up the technical college system in South Carolina, of which I am an employee and of which you are attending a class of. But the South traditionally elected senators for an incredibly long period of time. And so they all became chairmen of key committees, and that's why the South had so much political power. From the beginning of the 20th century until the Reagan Revolution in the 1980s, the Southern Democratic Party, even though a lot of people would say it was out of step with the rest of the nation, had tremendous amounts of power. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Campaign finance law. And there's my buddy George. Okay, so the first campaign finance law was because the founding father of our nation, George Washington, first in war, first in peace, first in the hearts of his countrymen, turned out to be a bit of a shady dude back in the 1750s. In 1757, George Washington ran for the Virginia House of Burgesses. He lost hard. So the next election comes up. He spends $195 on booze. I want you to think about that. He spent 109 2 years later at 17. He lost in 1755. 1757, he comes back and he spends $195 when the average person was making $10 or less a year. He drops $195 on punch and hard cider. Okay, he pulled it off and won, but the House of Burgesses were so angry that they immediately passed a law that said that no candidate or any persons on their behalf could give voters, quote, money, meat, drink, entertainment, or provision, or any present, gift, reward, or entertainment, etc., in order to be elected, or any present, gift, reward, or entertainment, etc., in order to be nominated. So the first campaign finance law we have in the United States is because our first president got really shady. In 1767, Congress passed what's called the Naval Appropriations Bill that made it illegal for government officials to solicit Navy Yard workers for money. Congressmen were going to the Navy Yards and saying, like, hey, how would you guys like to get a new Navy contract so that you guys get to build 5 more ships and all you guys are working full time for the next 5 years? Sure, give me $10. And that was happening. We've already talked extensively about the Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act. We've also talked about the Hatch Act. Go back and look at those. Go to the next one and picture my favorite picture, smiling Teddy Roosevelt. In 1907, President Roosevelt, remember, he came in as the trust buster. He didn't like big corporations. President Roosevelt gets the Tillman Act passed, making it illegal for corporations to contribute money to campaigns. But it had no enforcement provisions in it. So they went back, and in 1910 they passed the Federal Corrupt Practices Act, which makes Congress disclose their campaign finances. Again, similar laws were passed for senators, but the court struck it down almost immediately. So in 1913, the next big thing that happens with campaign finance is the 17th Amendment is passed, which calls for the direct election of all senators instead of election by the state legislatures. So you now have 100 more elections. Every state has a member of the Senate. More elections mean more elections, more money. Okay? Go to the next one with my smiling cousin, FDR. That's my favorite picture of FDR, by the way. Makes it seriously look like he's up to something. 1943, Roosevelt got the Smith-Connolly Act passed. No unions could contribute to a campaign. So in 1943, a political action committee was formed, the Congress of Industrial Organizations, which said, hey, we're not a union, we're a collection of unions, which did not fall under the law. And they made big contributions. In 1947, the Taft-Hartley Act was passed, banning all corporations and unions from making any independent expenditures, even independent ones, and allowed for some public financing of campaigns. Go to the next slide with Tricky Dick Nixon. So in 1967, you remember how they passed a law that said Congress had to disclose their finances? Well, nobody collected that data until in 1967. In 1972, Nixon's campaign committee, which was known as the Committee to Re-elect the President, and was called CREEP. Now, somebody should have known from the get-go that any group of people that like to be called CREEP is a problem. So in 1972, it was found that Nixon's campaign committee, CREEP, had used campaign funds to both finance burglaries into Democratic headquarters around the country and to do a whole bunch of other bad things, and then they used the money to help cover up when some of the burglars got arrested. They tried to use the money to help cover things up. So in 1973, this big, huge campaign finance law was passed. It limits personal contributions and the contributions to political parties and to political action committees. So it says an individual can only contribute, I think it's like $2,500 to a single candidate, to a single political party, to a single political action committee. The federal government will provide matching funds to a candidate to a certain dollar figure, but there are serious strings attached. You have to disclose all your finances if you're going to accept that. Some candidates do take it, some candidates don't. I mean, like personal billionaires like Donald Trump didn't do it until way late in 2016. Michael Bloomberg didn't do it. Tom Steyer, who are both billionaires, they didn't do it either. The law allows political action committees and labor unions just to spend an unlimited amount of money, but they have to do it independently. In other words, it is illegal for them to coordinate with a campaign. So if Bob Smith is running against Jim Jones and the political action committee favors Bob Smith, they can't pick up the phone and call Bob Smith's campaign manager and say, hey, what do you want us to say? But what they can do is they can run horribly offensive negative ads against Jim Jones. And that's perfectly okay. The law created what's called soft money, allowing people to give unlimited amounts of money to a political party or committee as long as it wasn't marked for a specific candidate. So if I have a political action committee that is, say, just the Americans for Goodness Committee, and I don't come out and specifically endorse a candidate, people can give me as much money as I want. That's why you see people giving hundreds of millions of dollars every campaign cycle. Again, specific people that donate, like George Soros on the Democratic side gives hundreds of millions of dollars every year to political action committees, not to parties, not to candidates, but to the PACs. Go to the next slide. Again, here's a picture of Senator McCain. It's Senator Feingold. In 2000, Senator McCain and Senator Feingold attempted to ban soft money. They wanted to put a lot of much stricter limitations on individual contributions. They tried to limit the amount of money that you could give a political action committee. And then it also restricted unions and corporations from giving money to those political action committees. Go to the next one. Campaign finance law, Citizens United versus the Federal Election Committee in 2010. So Citizens United was a political action committee that felt that they were being disadvantaged because they couldn't take huge, massive donations from corporations and unions and groups and individuals in order to run political campaign ads. And so they took it to court. And the court found 5-4 that the prohibition on union and corporations' independent spending violated the First Amendment. The First Amendment, the court said, not only protects individuals, but it protects groups of individuals working together. So, as it says in the third bill, corporations and trade unions have the same rights as individuals in spending as an exercise of free speech. And it gave birth to super PACs, and these are PACs, political action committees, where there's no accountability. They don't have to disclose their funding. They can just spend whatever they want to. They can collect money from whoever they want to. And a lot of people say the problem that we're having in our elections right now is there's just too much money that's not accountable. Too many people can get too much advertising and say whatever they want, even if it's not true. And so that's where we're at now. If you go to the one that says campaign finance law, the last one there with the $100 bills, okay? So you can see with campaign finance law the same thing that's happening with voting, with civil rights, with everything else that we've been discussing over the entirety of this course. That we have an idea in our heads about how things should work. And then we grow to that idea, and then when we get to that idea, then a lot of times we just overshoot and go past it. When it comes to campaigns, who gets to vote, we've always expanding that. Excuse me. And again, we said over and over again that our democracy, our republic is defined by the growth of the inclusion. Now we're getting to the point now where we're shrinking that again. Where to participate in politics, a lot of people say you got to have the money to be able to do it. And there's a lot to be argued for that. Okay. Let's go to the next slide. So that's it. You have gotten what you're going to get out of me for this. This is our last lecture. I have just run out of, again, let's say coffee. And now let's ask ourselves what we've learned. Okay? We started off way back, and again, I haven't prepared anything for this, so I'm going to be freestyling for the next couple of minutes. We started off way back when we talked about the Magna Carta. We talked about the growing that the human condition naturally seems to expand human rights and human engagement and civil rights and civil liberties. We started out talking about the compromises, that there was nothing pretty about the way this nation was born. And I'm not just talking about war. It was done through politics. who gets the say and how the country's run. People wanted to do as little as possible. People were happy with the Articles of Confederation until the Articles of Confederation didn't work anymore and Shays' Rebellion came up. And so we formed this Constitution that was imperfect, to say the least. Immediately they decided that, had to compromise on what the Constitution even would be. It would just be the framework for the government. And then we began to build on that framework. And we began to expand that framework. And we immediately passed 10 amendments to guarantee our individual liberties. And so we've continued to expand and expand and expand and expand participation. And it's not always been clean, and it's not always been pretty, and it's not always responded adequately. But in most cases, it does err towards giving people more rights. Is it quick and is it pretty? No, it's not. It's never been. And certainly we talked about civil liberties. We talked about Jim Crow. We talked about how long it took women to get the vote, which is just insane. The fact that women had the vote in several states in 1770, and then we passed the Constitution that guaranteed everyone's freedom. One of the things that's oftentimes forgotten is in 5 states, women lost the vote. Okay, so there's been this constant pulling back and forth. But the anchor in it all has always been the U.S. Constitution, and you guys now know more about the Constitution than apparently our president does. And now we've talked a lot about our president over time. I want to talk to you about what happened yesterday. We're all in the midst of a national crisis, the likes of which we haven't seen probably since World War II. Certainly, you could say since the Great Depression. Is an economic crisis, is a medical crisis. We haven't seen anything since the 1918 Spanish flu epidemic. So we're in tumultuous times, and what should be governing us and how we run and how we move forward is going to be the Constitution of the United States. And now you guys know. Hey, listen. When somebody looks at you and says, and I say this, and I've had this conversation many times, because I told you, a lot of people in my family support the president, and that's okay. I respect them for it. But when somebody looks at you and says that, the Constitution of the United States was written to allow us to own guns, so if we needed to, we could overthrow the government. Well, okay, you say that, but then why does Article 1, Section 8 explicitly give the Congress the authority to put down an insurgency or a rebellion in the United States? Why, if that's true, why was it the one catalytic event that caused us to write the Constitution, the fact that we had trouble putting down Shays' Rebellion? The Constitution was written because of a rebellion that people had trouble putting down. Why would they write it just 2 years later so that you could rebel if you wanted to? Okay, so you guys now know that. You want to have another argument about guns and why you should own whatever gun you want? That's fine. You have that right in the United States. But let's argue from a point of knowledge. Okay? Yesterday, and this is April 14th, yesterday, April 13th, the president had one of his most bat-crazy press conferences ever. He's in an article came out on Sunday from the New York Times saying basically for the month of February, the president had all the information he needed to react to the COVID-19 pandemic, and he just did nothing for a month. So now the president, we're beginning to see things peak. We're beginning to see things level off. So the president is now coming out talking about reopening the country, which every competent medical official, almost every governor, is saying you can't do that yet. He wants to open the country back up on the 1st of May. So many people in knowledgeable are saying, no, you can't do that. Well, yesterday, the President of the United States said, and this is a quote, when people started to push back, he said, I'm going to open the country on the 1st of May, and the governors are going to do it. Well, a lot of people started asking him about that because they've heard of, remember that basic concept, federalism, where the state governors have authority. And somebody asked him about that. And then the president said, and I want to quote him here so that there's nobody can say anything. When someone is the president of the United States, the authority is total, and that's the way it's got to be. It's total. The governors know that. You guys have read Article 2, Article 1, Article 2, and Article 3 of the Constitution. You know that's not true. And then CNN White House correspondent Caitlin Collins asked him about this authority is total line. She just said, That's not true. I mean, Caitlin Collins, I'm not a big fan of CNN, but Caitlin Collins, the CNN White House correspondent, just called him out and said, Mr. President, you've said that. It's not true. And Trump replied, and again, I'm going to quote him so there's no arguments. You know what you're doing? You're going to write on. We're going to write up papers on this. It's not going to be necessary because the governors need us one way or the other. Because ultimately, it comes with the federal government. That being said, we're getting along very well with the governors, and I feel very certain that there won't be any problems. And Collins went back and asked him. I haven't asked. He said, "What governors have you asked about this? What governor agreed that you have this authority?" And Trump said, I haven't asked anybody. You know why? Because I don't have to. And when she tried to ask another question, he said, enough, please. Okay? So the president has tried to exert, the president of the United States saying he has total authority to do whatever he wants, which we all know is categorically untrue when you read the Constitution of the United States. Go to the last slide. I want to wind up with this and sort of frame the entire course with this. It's kind of a long quote from James Madison from the Federalist Papers 51. The interest of the man must be connected with the constitutional rights of the place. It may be a reflection on human nature that such devices should be necessary to control the abuses of government. But what is government itself but the greatest of all reflections of human nature? If men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. In framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place, oblige it to control itself. So we have this balance that we've talked about since day one. There is this push and pull between the rights of the individual and the necessities for a government. I charge you at this point, in 2 years, you will be electing not South Carolina, but you will be electing a new governor. You will be allowed to vote, or you will have the right to exercise your vote for a member of the U.S. House of Representatives, your local South Carolina House of Representatives, the Aiken County Commission. These are the people that are going to determine what kind of education you get in college, what kind of taxes you pay. And now, as we can see, whether or not you're going to be able to get a test for a viral disease. Things like that. These are the people, and as the old saying goes, and I'm going to clean it up a little bit for you guys because I got in trouble one time for saying it straight up. If you don't vote, you can't whine. Okay? So, vote intelligently. Vote your conscience. Be informed when it comes to your government. Hold your government accountable for how they spend your money. It's not theirs. And just stay on top of things, because don't let let's face it, the majority of people that vote right now, the biggest voting bloc is old white dudes like me. You do not want me running your government. I think I'm a good guy, and I think I would look out for your interest. But the best people in the poll in an election to look out for your interest is you. Okay? So with that, we will sign off. Watch Blackboard. I will post the Blackboard discussion question in a matter of a few minutes. You're going to have 5 days to get that done. That'll give you till, probably give you till next Monday. I will post some announcements on the final here in the next coming days, and you will see that. So until then, thanks for participating in the class. Right up until the time we all got quarantined. Stay safe, stay healthy, stay sane. Email me if you have any questions, and when we can all get out and move back around again, my office is still going to be on the campus of Aiken Technical College. Feel free to call me up.